So good morning, everyone. So welcome to our webinar on the role of water utilities in supporting rural WASH, which it's a really fascinating topic for all of us. And it's been one of the key things we've been looking at under our WASH TA. So a little bit of housekeeping before we start. So if you can please turn your microphone off during the presentation. We'll be monitoring the chat. So if you want to make a point, if you've got a comment or a question, please raise your hand. And use the chat box there. So drop the questions in and we'll keep an eye on that. And we'll also have a QA portion after the presentation today. And we'll have some panel discussion and some questions for all of our speakers. So please make use of that. And I think the speakers will be happy if you've got any specific questions on their presentation to take some questions at the end before we move on, or otherwise keep them for the panel discussion. So today, I'll hand over very shortly to the CEO of the PWWA, Lucia Sefo-Liao. So welcome, Lucia. Lucia has graciously opened every one of our webinars and given us some introductory remarks and given us the Pacific context on all of our webinars. So much appreciated. And Lucia has to dash off shortly today. And then welcome to the new DDG of the Pacific Department, Hideaki Iwasaki. So welcome. I think this might be the first webinar that you've joined us. So welcome along. Much appreciated your support and your time today. I'll do a couple of slides just to set the scene. Then I'll hand over to Marike Adunk, Senior Program Officer for the IRC, to talk about what's happening around the world with rural WASH. And then we'll have a look in the Pacific. So Anna Ake, our national consultant for the ADB on our TA project, Anna will talk about the work she's been doing in Tonga and the situation for rural WASH in Tonga. Then Elise Senekuta from Water Authority of Fiji will talk about rural WASH in Fiji. And then we'll have Kudusi from Tonga Water Board join us for the panel discussion to give Tonga Water Board's perspective on Anna's presentation and rural WASH from the Tonga Water Board perspective. And then, as always, we'll have a little poll at the end of it and grab a group photo of our Pacific family. Okay, so Lucia, good morning, welcome.
Good morning, and thank you, Dean. I also like to say thank you to Hideaki for giving me the opportunity to speak first, and also to say hello to our usual coordinators and also the speakers for today. I noticed there are quite a number of you attending, 32 in total, and that's very exciting to see and to hear. And warm welcome and talofa everyone to more of our webinar series this year. And this series of webinars is made possible through a collaboration between the ADB and PWWA. And we are very grateful for this collaboration with ADB. The past webinars have not only been a useful avenue for sharing knowledge and experiences, but also for building a network of industry and utilities community that shares similar challenges and hopefully solutions. Today's webinar, as Dean has already said, will discuss the role of water utilities in supporting rural WASH. Rural areas are home to most of those who lack access to improved sources of drinking water and safe sanitation. Water supply and sanitation are often more challenging in rural areas due to their environmental fragility and relatively poor economic conditions. Development models dominated by diverse cultural values, poor economic conditions, and associated cost recovery challenges. In many cases, scattered settlements dominated by agro-based economy and limited water resources give rise to challenges for infrastructure provision. In rural areas, public water provision and sanitation services, as well as water infrastructures such as water collection points, Pit latrines and septic tanks are often inadequately maintained and in poor shape. In addition to this lack of services, natural water sources such as wells, pumps, and rivers are often contaminated and provide an unreliable supply. And as water technologies are often designed for urban contexts, they may not take into account the specificities of rural areas in terms of energy efficiency, the use of natural treatment systems, and cultural appropriateness. Most of our 30 member water and wastewater utilities are urban-based and mandated to provide these services for a particular urban population, leaving rural areas to various government ministries and NGOs. And some of you have started planning ahead for safe access for WASH to the whole population, heeding the call for universal access to safe water and sanitation. And I feel this is the right move for most of our utilities, as you are best placed to provide that service in terms of the knowledge, skills, and expertise that cannot be duplicated in your countries. Though, of course, it will require some forward planning, working together with the government and looking at new business models of infrastructure development and investment specifically for the rural people that ensures the sustainable infrastructure development and operation and infrastructure development strategies that reconcile the conflicting domestic and agriculture water demand and efficient use and reuse of water resources. New institutional enabling institutional and governance structures, for example, decentralization and devolution, level of participation of NGOs and community organizations, policies and regulation, cost recovery and subsidies are some of the areas that you probably need to also look into. Now, that's not at all impossible, is it? It just needs brave and committed champions of water like yourselves. Thank you for your attention and have a fruitful and productive webinar today. Thank you, Dean.
Many thanks, Lucia. That's a great introduction to our topic today, and you've certainly thrown the gauntlet down, I think, to all of us on the call today, utilities and people that support utilities, about how we might be able to grapple with that challenge of rural WASH. So many thanks. Hideaki, I'd like to hand over to you now. So welcome to our webinar.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dean. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be joining this WASH webinar. I understand that this is the third for this year and the 18th in this series. Actually, this is my second time joining this. Yeah, and I'm very happy that we are co-hosting these webinars with the Pacific Water and Wastewater Association. As the challenges we face in providing safe water access in rural areas, the CEO Lucia ably presented those. So I'm not going to the details of those challenges and what are the practical, solutions that may be provided by listening to cases from the region. I used to be involved in providing another important services to rural areas. I'm a civil engineer, and I used to be involved in rural road connectivity provision in other parts of Asia. And listening to CEO Lucia, I understand that there are common challenges. What type of facility you provide to rural areas, which would be sustainably maintained, and also the recovery of the cost and to maintain the facility, how that can be done. Of course, in the case of rural connectivity, it's difficult to charge individual users. Then we need to rely on other means, budgetary allocation, or quasi-user charge mechanisms like fuel taxes earmarked for maintaining rural roads. I used to deal with these challenges, and I see that there are similar challenges in rural areas. And on top of that, I think water resources are finite, and you need to share these limited resources to various purposes. I see that that's another major challenge we face in rural areas. So I'm quite excited that we are supporting these webinars, and also particularly I'm interested to hear from the colleagues joining today how we are addressing these challenges. We're hearing from the Water Authority of Fiji on their work to support water security in rural communities, along with findings from the Village Water Committee pilot in Tonga. The ADB has supported alongside the Tonga Water Board. And we also look forward to hearing from the IRC, who will present on their research into the utilization of rural water services and share learnings from case studies on how water utilities have navigated this process. And I'm also looking forward to hearing from everyone in this panel discussion. And I'm sure the insights and examples offered will be of use to many other utilities across the Pacific. And actually, I would say not only in the Pacific, but many other parts of Asia and the world. Thank you again for joining us today. And I hope we'll have engaging and productive discussion. And also, if you find this webinar helpful, useful, please feel free to reach out to ADB's Pacific WASH TA to see how we can support rural WASH in your countries and utilities. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Hideaki. I'll keep moving along this morning. We've got quite a bit to get to, and I don't want to take time away from our guest speakers. So I'll hand over in a sec. I've done a brief introduction to everybody there. So that's our speakers, and Kadusi's joining us as a panelist today. So a brief introduction from me. So I'll just share with you what we see as the water management in the Pacific. As you can see, it's a really complex structure if you look at it for the whole of Pacific, and every one of the countries there has water utility that largely looks after the urban areas, and then rural WASH in most cases is handled by other departments and ministries. And unfortunately, you can see down the middle there, that dividing line in a lot of countries is actually a hard dividing line. So there's and a lot of reasons that we'll go through today why it's hard to cross that barrier. And as much as utilities with all of their expertise might want to help in rural WASH, they do have constraints. So I won't go through that in any detail, but that'll be in the slide pack there to have a look at after the webinar. So the challenges, Lucia and Hideaki have outlined a lot of those for us this morning. So again, I won't go through all of these in detail. They'll come up in our case studies. But there certainly are the geographic constraints that utilities face. That a lot of the times that they look after services on larger islands in the Pacific countries, and the rural WASH happens on the smaller islands that are often quite remote. So it does create a challenge for utilities how they do that. Access to resources, so water resources and the land and skilled workforce is difficult in Pacific countries. There often aren't, particularly the infrastructure and the skilled workforce is really difficult to acquire. And highly skilled people that work in our water industry are valuable employees, and they unfortunately often move off and do other things. So it's hard to maintain that pool of skilled people, particularly if you're trying to do it in a utility as well as have the same sort of skills helping out rural WASH and village water committees, that they really do need to do the same job as a utility. So it's hard to get the skills. And then as Hideaki said about the financial constraints, someone needs to pay. So how do you recover the cost, particularly from a utility that might be looking to support rural WASH activities when it's outside of their mandate and they don't get paid for doing it. And we'll talk a bit about that in some of the presentations. Operation and maintenance. It's really difficult to do, and we're working in some of the countries at the moment, and things that might be relatively simple spare parts to acquire in Australia, New Zealand, or through Asia are actually really difficult in the Pacific. So it just takes one breakdown and all of a sudden you can be without out of water supply, and that's hard for utilities, but it's even harder once you start to get into rural WASH, and we see plenty of examples there that the one pump in a village breaks down and all of a sudden they're out of water. And we're all grappling with climate change and disaster, so the impacts on resilience. And again, it's water utilities are geared up to start to take on these challenges, but often the rural WASH starts to suffer and they're not as well equipped. And then the biggest barriers potentially are the governance and regulatory frameworks that exist in every country that don't make it easy for utilities in particular to cross over the boundary and help out in rural WASH. So today's webinar, we'll have a look at how utilities around the world are increasing their support for rural WASH. And Marike's got some great case studies that we can look at from other places around the world that might be applicable to the Pacific. And there are a lot of opportunities, and it'd be great to hear from Tonga and Fiji about how the utilities there are moving in to support the communities as much as they possibly can. But there are some questions to keep in mind, and we might explore these a bit in the panel discussion today. So how can utilities best do that support for rural WASH? And it's not always the case that they just take over. There are other ways to do it. How do we get the enabling environment set up, and what needs to be addressed to allow utilities to do that, to move out of what often are legislated boundaries of the work they can do? And who's best placed to do it? So is it the government, utilities, or communities that can help drive this change? And what can utilities do now to provide that support? So keep those questions in the back of your mind as we go through our presentations today. And we'll come back and hopefully as a team explore that a little bit later in the webinar. So now I'd like to hand over to Marike, and special thanks to our Marike and our other guests that have joined us today from Europe. I'm not sure, is it about 2 a.m. there for you, Marike?
Yeah, it's 2:21 now.
2:21, so enough talk from me. So thanks for staying up so late or getting up so early to join us today, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks very much, Dean. It's my pleasure to be with all of you today and to learn a lot from the Pacific, which is a region of the world I'm not that familiar with. So I'll be mostly presenting the global perspective from a study that we've done on utility managed rural water services. I'll be talking about models, pathways, and performance and enabling environment. As was said by Dean, there is these boundaries between the urban water supply and rural water supply. But we've seen over the last couple of years, last couple of decades, maybe even, that boundary is blurring a bit. That boundary between utility managed urban water supply and often community or local government managed rural water supply, that boundary is blurring slowly. And that we've seen that utilities are increasingly moving into the rural areas. They're increasingly providing water services in these rural areas as well. And that process of utilities going into rural water supply is what we call utilization of rural water supply, an impossible word to pronounce or to write, but it basically means utilities moving into rural water supply. So in this presentation, I'll try to address 4 main questions. Firstly, what are the pathways under which utilization of rural water supply takes place? Secondly, what are the actors and the factors that drive this move of utility managed rural water supply? Thirdly, does utilization of rural water supply actually improve rural water services? Does it improve it in terms of coverage and service levels? And what are some of the challenges and how can these overcome, or how have these been overcome? And I'll be presenting on that based on a mapping that we've done from some 32 models of utility managed rural water supply from some 22 countries from all over the world, including both high income, medium income, and low income countries. So, but first, I'd like to define what a utility actually is and to get common understanding on that. So the way that we've defined what utilities are is that they, first of all, are responsible for direct provision of water services to clients. So direct provision of water services to clients. Secondly, they are responsible for operation and maintenance, for revenue collection, and they can be possible, but don't have to be responsible for asset development and replacement of assets. What is important for utilities is that they have professional operational staff as well as professional executive management. So that means paid operational staff and paid executive management staff. And that's where it sets it apart from community management, which is often through volunteer operational staff and water committee members. We also define utilities as being a legally established corporate entity with its management of revenues and expenditure autonomous from local government. And that's how we see it apart from municipal management or local government management or local government service, water service provision. So we have seen that there's often a bit of a gray area between community management and utility management, and between utility management and municipal management, but we've tried to look at utility models that really adhere to these four criteria. So then let's have a look at that first question. What are the pathways? What are the ways in which utilization of rural water supply happens? What are the ways that we have observed that through that kind of global study by looking at all these kind of cases? Then we've seen actually three main pathways. The first pathway is where you have a utility, usually focused in a rural area, that then expands into its services into the rural areas that surround urban areas. So in that case, there is already an established utility, so there's no new utility established. And that utility expands its services, it expands its infrastructure into the rural areas. And in that way, you get utility managed rural water services. The second way in which we've seen this happening is by utilities taking over existing systems, existing assets that were previously managed under different management models. So for example, when there was community management or municipal management, and then a utility comes in, either an existing utility or a newly established utility comes in and it takes over the management of these existing systems. That is the second pathway that we've observed happening quite a lot. And that's what we've called the service delivery model change, or the management model change pathway. And the third pathway that we've observed is where you have a completely new management model, a completely new service delivery model being implemented, being introduced in a rural area. These are quite often kind of emerging models where you have a new utility being introduced in a rural area that develops its own infrastructure, that hand in hand with the development of infrastructure. So in that case, you have really the introduction of a new service delivery model, a new related to utility managed rural water supply. We've also seen that quite often there can be multiple pathways, or there can be hybrid pathways, multiple pathways that can either happen at the same time. So for example, in Zambia, we've seen commercial utilities both expanding into rural areas to Pathway 1, but also taking over existing systems from utility managed schemes through Pathway 2. And we've also seen these kind of pathways happening in succession. So it starts as kind of an expansion into rural areas through Pathway 1, but then the utility also starts taking over other schemes from community managed models, for example, through Pathway 2. So these are the kind of pathways that we see happening. And that then results in different types of utilities along the urban-rural continuum. So we have the completely urban utilities on one side. They can either be a single service area, or they can have multiple service areas. And on the other hand of the spectrum, we see the fully rural utilities, which might be a bit rare in the Pacific, but in other countries, we have seen these models as well. For example, in Ethiopia, where you have dedicated rural utilities that only serve the rural areas. So in between that, we have the urban focused utilities, where you have like that urban center, and it's where you have a utility serving the urban area, but then also its surrounding rural area. And then we also have the mixed utilities, often regional utilities that serve both, that serve an area which contains both urban areas as well as rural areas. And these kind of urban focused utilities often emerge from Pathway 1, where you have that expansion of an existing utility. The Pathway 2, that service delivery model change that results often in these kind of mixed utilities, but also in completely rural utilities. And at Pathway 3, where you have a new service delivery model being implemented in rural areas, that tends to, we've seen that mostly result in fully rural utilities. And the hybrid pathways we've mostly seen being taken and being then resulted in these kind of mixed utilities, where utilities serve both urban as well as rural areas. So just to give a little bit of a feel for what that can look like, we can look at an example from Uganda, where we've seen different utilization pathways emerge under different models. And that includes the expansion of the national water company into the rural areas. So there's a national water company that serves the different towns, including, as you can see here, Fort Portal, which is a town in Gaborone district. And you can see between 2017 and 19, it has been expanding its area into the rural area. You can see that here in the map in blue. In addition to that, in Uganda, there's been also the emerging of a new model, a new utility model, the umbrella organization that used to be a support organization, an organization that provided support to community management. But because of capacity constraints and a lot of challenges of that community management, the government decided to convert these support organizations, these umbrella organizations, actually into utilities that are directly responsible for the management of the schemes that were previously under community management. So that's very much Pathway 2, where you have this kind of service delivery model change. And that you can see here emerging in this map in 2017. You can see the yellow areas which were under community management. Some of these areas in 2019 were taken over, are now green areas. And the green areas are the ones that are now under that umbrella organization management. So a new emerging type of utility. So that those kind of processes we also see in other countries. For example, in Vietnam, we see the three pathways actually emerging, including pathway 3, where you have a new model emerging, which is the private owner operators that are managing small pipe schemes, where you really have a new type of utility emerging that develops its own infrastructure. So that's through pathway 3. So then the second question, what is driving this utilization process for rural water supply? So we've seen globally that there's many driving actors and many driving factors. The actors that drive it are both the central government, but also the development partners and utilities themselves. We've seen central government driving these kind of the increase of utility management in rural areas through mandate change. They're actually mandating utilities to start operating in urban areas. For example, that example that we just saw in Uganda with the umbrella organizations. But it can also be through stimulation of utilization of rural water supply. Again, in that Uganda example, the national utility was stimulated to expand its services through co-financing of central government for the utility to have a project in expanding into rural areas. So it's both through mandate as well as stimulation. Development partners also play an important role and can drive these kind of changes. For example, through influencing local or central government by having these mandate changes and stimulating utilization. But they can also play a more direct role, for example, through financial and technical support. As we, for example, saw in Ethiopia, where UNICEF provided direct support to financial and technical support for the setup of rural utilities, directly responsible for providing rural water services. And we've also seen utilities themselves play a driving role, especially related to their drive to expand their customer base. That can be an important driver for utilities to expand into rural areas. So on the factor side, we've seen that there have been contextual factors related to population and economic growth that have resulted in higher levels of water demand. And those higher levels of water services are typically provided by utilities. And therefore we've seen that kind of demand for utility services also in rural areas. We've also seen that involvement of utilities in rural water supply have been driven by these expectations that it can improve water services related to the level of service, but also to the coverage, the extent to which the rural areas can be covered with water services. It is expected that utilities have better cost recovery and can attract more investments into rural areas. It's also expected that they can address capacity issues, especially related to community management, and that they can bring economies of scale. And these are all important driving factors for having more utility involvement in rural water supply. This is can also be driven by regulatory change. An example for that, we've seen, for example, in Zambia, where the regulator changed the mandates of the commercial utilities in the country to include to be able to provide services for both urban areas as well as rural areas. And in that way, kind of provided the opportunity for the utilities to expand their services and to take over schemes that were formerly under community management in the rural areas. We've also seen that bulk water supply, the provision of bulk water supply can be a driving factor. For example, in Namibia, where the state utility was providing water in to bulk water to municipalities, but there were rural areas on those transmission lines, and therefore the utility decided to also provide water services to those rural areas. And finally, it can also be driven by a supply base. For example, it can be supply driven. For example, especially for the owner-operator management models, that's an important driver, where actually the utility itself or a private operators interested in providing rural services, so from the supply side. So then the next question is, has this kind of introduction, this drive of more utility managed rural water supply, has that improved rural water coverage, and has it improved service levels? And it's a bit double, yes. On one hand, definitely, we've seen that more people are being reached through this involvement of utilities in the rural areas. And often these people in the rural areas, in that way, get more reliable services. But there's also challenges. There are a lot of these utility managed rural water service delivery models have had challenges with going to scale. In this graph, you see kind of a mapping of different models of utility managed rural water supply. And you can see that the majority of these models have not managed to reach more than 20% of the rural population. So there are still different service delivery models as well that compete with the utility managed models. So bringing it to scale tends to be a bit of a challenge. There's also equity issues. Utilities tend to try to pick the low-hanging fruit. They're more interested in providing services to the people that they can easily reach. So the people that are more difficult to reach in the more remote rural areas, they might be left behind when they rely solely on utility services. So that's a challenge that needs to be taken into account. And then finally, we've also seen that a higher level of services are there, but they're not a guarantee, especially when utilities provide rural water services through public standpipes, so not through connections on people's premises or in people's homes, but through public standpipes that might still be some distance for people to walk, then that might not make such a big difference from the traditional community managed hand dug wells and other point sources. So it doesn't necessarily provide a higher level of service. So then let's look at some of the challenges and on how to overcome these. First, looking at the utilities themselves. We've actually seen through the cases that we've looked at that a lot of the utilities face quite similar problems as community managed service providers in rural areas, especially related to financial issues and capacity issues, including the challenges of attracting staff in rural areas. I can imagine that's especially the case in remote islands in the Pacific. But also low consumption rates in rural areas and the high transaction costs of revenue collection. And to overcome these challenges, we've seen that aggregation and consolidation of utilities has been quite successful in a lot of these models. And that really leads to economies of scale. And we've also seen that addressing those capacity issues, that national capacity building platforms have been very useful for that, as well as having water operator partnerships. With stronger utilities providing support to some weaker utilities. So then let's have a look at some of the challenges and how to overcome these of the enabling environment. Utilities that provide rural water services, but also utilities that provide urban water services, and also community managed organizations, all service providers, they don't operate in a vacuum, as we all know. They need an enabling environment, and that enabling environment includes the policies and institutional systems. It includes capacity building mechanisms and systems, monitoring and planning systems, financial systems, and regulatory and accountability systems. And we've seen by looking at these different models that we've been looking at, that actually the policies and the institutional frameworks tend to be largely in place to enable utilities to provide rural water services. And we've seen that the capacity building mechanisms tend to be a bit stronger for utilities than for other rural water service providers, especially the community managed service providers. We've seen some examples of strong capacity building mechanisms, for example, joint research for water companies by a separate institution in the Netherlands. We've seen sector learning through technical meetings and fora organized by the Utility Association, for example, in Colombia. And again, those water operator partnerships have been a good way of providing that capacity support. And those water operator partnerships, we've seen that with north-south partnerships, so to speak, where utilities from the global north support utilities from the global south. But we've also seen that through south-south partnerships, for example, utility from Uganda supporting utilities in Ethiopia. And we've seen it also within countries themselves with, for example, stronger urban utilities providing capacity support to weaker rural utilities or mixed utilities. And that's been quite successful. For the monitoring, we've seen that monitoring fewer and more centralized service providers is a lot easier than monitoring a lot of small ones. So monitoring a few utilities is easier than monitoring lots and lots of community managed committees. But nevertheless, strong monitoring systems, they're not always in place, they're often lacking. And that's especially the case for the emerging models, especially the ones that emerge through that pathway 2 and 3, through those service delivery model change pathways and those emerging service delivery model pathways. It tends to be a bit stronger for the pathway 1, where you have a urban utility already that has, where often you do have monitoring systems for. In general, we've seen that funding and financing systems are weak, and that was especially observed in the lower and middle income countries. We have seen some good examples from the Netherlands, England, Wales, those kind of countries. And we've seen there that what has been quite successful is that that investments were enabled even with relatively low tariffs because of low non-revenue water, but also because of access to cheap loans on the financial market, and because of governments enabling and setting favorable conditions for attracting private capital. On the regulation side, we've seen different models for regulating urban management of rural water services, including regulation by an agency or by a contract, either with local government or with central government, or by self-regulation, as is happening in the Netherlands. But we've seen those regulatory models tend to be they tend to be in place for the utilities that have evolved through that pathway 1, that expansion pathway where you have an existing utility and it expands into the rural area. But for those other models, those other pathways where you have a new utility providing rural services, or where a utility is taking over from, for example, utility management or from municipal management, there the regulatory systems tend to be a lot weaker and need a lot more attention. So in general, what we've seen by looking at all these cases, we've seen that the enabling systems and the enabling environment tends to be stronger for the older and the bigger regional utilities, especially the utilities where consolidation and aggregation processes have resulted in rather large utilities with strong financial systems and strong regulatory systems. So all in all, concluding, we've seen that utilities are playing, and we expect that they will play also in the future, an increasing role in providing rural water services in the years to come, basically everywhere in the world. And I expect that that is also happening, and that you're observing that as well in the Pacific. However, utility management for rural water supply, it's not a panacea for overcoming the rural water supply challenges. There's definitely still a very strong need for strengthening utility performance related to cost recovery, related to non-revenue water, etc., as well as strengthening that enabling environment, especially related to regulatory and financial systems. And that is all needed in order to have successful utilization of rural water supply. So with that, I will hand back over to Dean. But before that, if you want to know more about this, if you're interested in reading about more case studies, more examples, then I'd direct you towards this thematic overview paper, for which the link can be found here. So with that, Dean, I'd like to hand back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Rico. That was a fascinating presentation, and we might catch up with questions that I haven't seen any pop up in chat in the panel discussion time, but yeah, there's certainly a lot to talk about there. And the thing that struck me as we were going through is that in the Pacific, we're not alone. It was in some way a bit comforting to see these challenges have been faced around the world and been grappled with around the world. So there's a lot we can learn, I think, not just looking at in the Pacific, but looking at what people are doing elsewhere. And I think around the world, people can look at the Pacific and see what's happening there as well. So great to share that information. So fascinating topic. And I think we could have had a half-day webinar on this and still not got through it all. So fantastic. So thanks a lot. What we might do now is have a look at what's happening in the Pacific in particular. So I'll hand over to Anna now, and Anna will take you through the work that she's been doing as part of the TA with the village water committees in Tonga. So Anna, over to you.
Thanks, Dean. Just gonna get through the slides here.
We'll just keep an eye on the time, Anna, about 15 minutes if we can.
I'm going to go through the pilot, some gaps and challenges, success stories that came out of the pilot that we've done in Tonga. Yeah, just with the TA activities, I think on the last one, we went through a list of, same thing for all the other countries, reduction in waterborne diseases and transmission of infectious diseases. And then it goes down to improved sustainable sanitation for all, whereby we have gone into entry points for sustainable wash and for health with campaigns, and then teaming up with government and utility support, where this pilot actually comes in. And we had a WASH convention last year, 2022, in August, where the outcomes of the convention was to create a baseline for WASH activities for future reporting, map out current and future investments, outline donor priorities and opportunities. It was organized by the WASH cluster, Ministry of Health, NEMO, the National Emergency Management Office, the Lantern Survey, Tonga Water Board, Ministry of Education, Public Enterprises, and Waste Authority. The work was supported by ADB and this TA, and there was the five where the pilot came out as part of it with discussions with town and district officers. And this was, of course, coordinated with the local villages, where there was a lot of things that we had to consider when looking at the pilot and the villages to pick out. The aim of the pilot was, of course, proposing legislation change to clause 3 of the water supply regulation, where it specifically states that there should be all male members. And we wanted to see if we could propose a change to include female members. Also to map out water assets. And so 3 villages were picked, 2 on the western side of the island and 1 on the eastern side for Uiteki and Fa'atomo. There was to be testing for E. coli in the village water system and the drinking water catchments, because we have water data that supports or states that 79% of drinking water that people have access to is tainted with E. coli. We just didn't know which drinking water sources they were. And then collect data from drinking water to find out where the contamination was, including rainwater tanks. Methodology was a 10% random sample from the 3 villages using the 2021 census, and the timeline has been 6 months. And so this has been a very long pilot, because it wasn't just going through one system. It was going through a lot of departments and working through our way with various ministries as well. And this is a map of Tonga, the main island. And you can see the 3 dots here on the western side is where the 2 villages of Fo'ui and Tekiu are located. And on the eastern side, we've got the village of Fa'atumu. And you've just got like baseline there with for Ui, the number of people in the village is 600. It ranges from 626 to about 410 people, about 122 households to about 71 households. Various boreholes were also identified in each village. Some would have 3 boreholes, but only 1 is operating or 2 are operating. Mainly diesel and solar and electric water pumps. And then they would have water towers with different capacities, and it is either located within the village or it is located outside of the village and then led in through several pipelines. The drinking water survey findings, with the help of an NGO, Morty, drinking water survey was carried out last year, November, to pinpoint the exact 79% of contamination. And that was ADB, that was a multi-indicator cluster survey and findings from UNICEF. The findings from the survey proved that 80% of the villages drink from their own water tanks or from that of their neighbors or other water tanks throughout the village, whether it's a church, a school, or a town hall. Very few drink from the reticulated water supply, and even less than 10% purchase drinking water. Most water tanks are not cleaned out annually or at all. And you can see from the pictures that it's not just cement tanks that are prone to collect dirt and debris from falling items, insects, rodents, and other things that creep into the water tanks. The amount of E. coli present in the water can only be assumed that it was carried into the tanks by these insects and rodents, climbing through the gutters, the roofings, and getting into the water tanks themselves. There's a simple solution to this, and just cleaning out the gatherings and the water tanks every 6 months or twice a year, once before the wet season starts, and then after the wet season is over. And this will ensure that there's enough water in the water tanks to last at least the 6 months of dry season. Longer if there is El Nino, shorter if it's a La Nina year. So depending on the weather and the year, it really everyone has the opportunity to clean out their tanks. And we have several water management legislations, and they span from the water regulations of 1963, which is under the Public Health Act. And in that regulation, nothing has been updated since 1963, which includes the village committee setup of having 10 members where all members are male. And that is where the regulation update that we wanted to see in order to have more female representation. It was obvious from talking to the town officers that the one committee that has female members was the most active, and whereas the rest of the other two didn't have any male representatives. They were all just male, and they weren't as active in their roles. There's several acts: the Environmental Impact Assessment, Waste Act 2005. Most of these acts have roles and responsibilities outlining what the roles of different departments and ministries are, where you've got water resource section at Ministry of Land and Survey, who monitor the groundwater resources, and you've got the rural supply, where it's managed by Ministry of Health and everything else that comes under it. And then you've got Tonga Water Board, who manage the urban areas, not just on the main island, but throughout the main island groups that we have. There's 4 main island groups. You can see that the setup is quite is managed nationally throughout various government ministries and departments, as well as utilities and NGOs. The vastness of the operation clearly shows that there is a need for an entity to manage all flows of communication and input of legislative works, policies, projects, research, and any other information pertaining and related to the WASH sector. It's too big for just one entity, and it is clear that there is a need for control and management of information, as seen from reports in the last 40 years. Who is better suited for this role? Utilities can be a moderator for the role and not be biased. And we have heard this from Marika's presentation. And of course, it's not something that can be done overnight. And just having this pilot made me see just how much work goes into communicating throughout the various departments, from communicating with Tonga Water Board to the Ministry of Health, to going after data that's housed by geology department, and you've got meter readings that's read somewhere else, but information doesn't flow right to the people who are using, like the town officers and the villages and the village committees, who are in charge of the daily functions of the village water committees in the rural areas. You've also got NGOs who do work in that sector. You've got the Ministry of Financing, who finances nearly all the public and ministerial management of finances that comes into the country. The findings that we had from the water testing, there were many tests that was carried out by geology, health, and Morty. And it was challenging to get the team to go out because we have two teams in two separate ministries under two different departments. And getting something as simple as a vehicle to go out and finding the right time that all team members were available was also difficult. There wasn't just that, there was also a challenge to finding the right equipment for the testing and the right people who could carry out the testing. But we finally managed to get the teams together, and they went out and did the testing in the 3 villages, where you have here, you can see the contaminated in orange. That is the amount of contaminated water tanks. And then you have a few of the water tanks that aren't contaminated in blue, and the highest village is Fo'ui. Fo'ui had the least amount of contamination because last year we had the volcanic eruption, and after the eruption, everyone went in to treat their water tanks. So either they were treated or they were cleaned out, and then they had new water into their tanks. The other two, however, the other 2 villages didn't get the same services that Fo'ui village got, just because Fo'ui is located on the peninsula that was hit by the tsunami. So I only brought in the contamination with E. coli and the electric conductivity and coliform. And of course, the acceptable levels for coliform should be 0, but you can see that coliform levels are quite high in the tap water testing. And electric conductivity, which is the salinity levels, the acceptable level should be a range from 0 to 1,500 microsiemens, and most of them have exceeded that level. So the salinity is quite high, and that was throughout the 3 villages, quite uniform. And so it means that high salinity levels in the tap water was found, and also high coliform in the tap water, but it was the same for the drinking water, which is mainly the water tanks, the rainwater harvest. The gaps and challenges of, as we have heard from the CEO earlier on, the challenges that we have in the WASH sector is quite uniform throughout the Pacific. Cost recovery, subsidies, infrastructural development, and so forth, are challenging throughout the Pacific. It's not just Tonga. We need more champions, not just in the community scene, but at local government, national level, across the ministries and departments, as well as into NGOs and church affiliate stakeholders, and eventually back to the committees who are the real MEPs. And without their commitment, there's no moving forward. This includes public awareness, working together for improving financial and tariff collections, as well as management of those finances and how they can contribute to the betterment of the WASH sector. And I'm just showing you one of the pictures that we took at one of the village boreholes, and you can just see the status of the water pump station. 2 stations that we saw. You got the picture on top is Fatumu, and they had solar panels. And in a simple solution to poorly designed village water supplies can be seen with these 2 solar panel installations. In order for there to be enough water to be pumped from the borehole to the water tower, there needs to be enough solar panels. In Fatumu's case, there's 46 panels to fill up the 40,000 towers that they have. the 4 panels that Dekiu village has at the bottom is not enough to pump any water into the tower, and they solely rely on an electric pump. The electricity costs alone ranges from $1,000 to $5,500 a month. And the water meter readings to the borehole for the 3 villages, it was clear some of the villages were extracting more than their comparable amount of water to household based on their demographic and the average amount of water per person designated by WHO as 50 to 100 liters a day. In New Zealand, the average amount of water is about 50 liters per person, but the study finds that usage is about 95. We can see from the graph that only 1 village is about 105 liters of average water use per day, which is for Ui. And then there's Dekiu with the most, which is 301 liters per person per day, followed by Fatumu with 234 liters per person per day. Dekiu is only one of the many villages where their water costing is being paid for by a cover club in New Zealand, meaning the average amount of $20 per family per month has not been collected since 2019 when COVID lockdowns happened. Fatumu's water supply is usually overflowing because they do not have a stop valve to stop the water from pumping and over pumping into their water towers. And this was made known by the town officer. And they had known and they had approached a guy to come and install a stop valve, but that guy sadly passed away. And since no one has been able to help them with their problem. Sinead, how can I play this?
We'll just run a little bit short of time today, Anna.
Yeah. So I think it's quite similar all around. We have to try to just get to the water pumps themselves. You know, we have to wade through tall elephant grass with the team. We had to that was just the water testing guys going around the 3 villages and doing the tests, the team from geology, the NGO, and we've got reviews that we are yet to make, and that is supposed to go back to the WASH cluster and propose from them to the Ministry of Health to have the regulation amended. And of course, this has to go all the way back to cabinet. And so when we had looked in the beginning at how water and sanitation is set up, everything goes all the way back to cabinet. Key findings, again, there were fragmented nature of the environment and limited national coordination. And I think this will be made available to everyone to have a look through. What we do know is that there is a need for coordination at the ground level. What we have heard is that we need now more than ever the help of utilities, because we need their skill sets. We need better management and just you know, an entity that can take over and make communication work throughout the entire framework that we have. And I think that's all for now from me. If you have any questions, just let me know.
Fantastic, Anna. It's been great work there in Tonga, and it's really, really helpful to have evidence there to help decision makers work out how they might be able to help better support those village water committees. And you know, particularly that you can see there from some of the photos Anna had about the lack of technical capability there. It's not that people don't want to do a good job often in the villages, they just don't know how to. So excellent, thanks, Anna. We'll see there were some questions, hopefully if we get some time for discussion. I'll hand over now to Elise to take us through what's been happening in WAF. Thanks, Elise.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Okay. Hello and Bola Vinaka, everyone. I hope you guys can hear me.
Loud and clear.
Okay. Thank you so much for the opportunity for allowing me to present this afternoon. It's actually after 1 here in Fiji, and for the purpose of my presentation for our WASH in rural areas, I'll be specifically looking at one of our projects, which is called the the Rainwater Harvesting Tank Initiative. Now, this is a government initiative that was initiated in 2016, and it has been proven successful, and government has been continuing to support us with this initiative up until to date. Before I go into the presentation, one of the things that I would like the participants to get a hold of and fair understanding of how Water Authority works in our rural areas here in Fiji is one of the key documents or key guides that we use is our National Rural Water and Sanitation Policy, which guides us on how we can assist, and also looking at sustainability of our projects in rural communities. And this is enabling our community members to take ownership of any rural project with regards to water that we implement into these communities. And one of these is the rainwater harvesting tank system or initiative. Now, with our rainwater harvesting tank initiative, one of the key areas where we're looking into when we try and match it with our values and our mission, we're looking at advocating on resilience, engaging our stakeholders, which is our community members, and also building capacity in allowing our recipients for this initiative to be informed on how to look after the tanks that have been given to them, as well as with the goal of sustainability. Like I've mentioned earlier, this is a government initiative that started off in 2016. From 2016 up until later 2019, we had been giving out tanks to our communities, whereby we gave them 5,000 liter tank. This is specifically for our rural areas, and further in to the presentation, then I will be highlighting on who in rural areas can apply for this initiative. But basically, the reason why this initiative came about was to help our community members in the rural areas to access clean, safe drinking water. This coincides with our 2013 constitution, where it states that every Fijian has a right to clean and safe drinking water. And our rural areas is mostly the people living in rural areas are mostly affected of accessing clean and safe drinking water. So one of the measures that government has put in place is the provision of water tanks that allows community members in rural areas to collect rainwater for their consumption. Now, on the requirements as to who can apply for this initiative, this initiative is free of charge. Our communities, our members in the rural areas do not have to pay a single cent, apart from a contribution from their end would be the provision of their tank bases and the installation of guttering. The tanks and the transportation of the tanks would be provided through this government initiative. Now, we work through areas, remote areas, going up inland, going also to the maritime islands, which includes, like for the areas that I work in, they're in the Central Eastern Division within the mainland, which is in Vitilevu. So in total, I have to cover a total of 7 provinces. This is on mainland, including the maritime islands as well. Apart from the rural areas, a definition of rural areas through the Water Authority, these are the areas where we do not supply our reticulation system. In other words, areas that Water Authority does not supply our treated water. This is where we indicate our rural areas. These are areas where they have their own water supply that is managed by their own water committees. Now, through the Rural Water and Sanitation Policy, the committees are obligated to have 2 or 3 women to be part of their committee members in order for them to be established and also access any water project improvements from any water utility, either it be the Water Authority or NGOs. So that is a must. So through the policy itself, it also engages everyone in the community to be managing, maintaining, and advocating on safeguarding their water sources, either it be their own rural water supply or their rainwater supply or borehole or any water source for that matter. This is just to look at sustainability, and it has worked for many of the rural areas and rural communities in the Central Eastern Division. This initiative is also applicable to areas living in our intermediate supply area. When I'm talking about intermediate supply areas, this includes our areas that Water Authority supplies our reticulated system. There's paying customers, but due to the area they are located and the amount of, because of its growing population, they only receiving water 2 hours in a day or less. So in these areas, we are also supplying them that they can apply for the rainwater initiative. And the requirements are the same for both. They just need to construct their tank bases and install their guttering. These are the ways where we can allow recipients to take ownership of the program rather than having everything being provided by government. And we have seen that it has been successful in these terms. Now, from 2016 up until 2022, in the Central Division alone, that is the data that I have there is the amount of applications that we have received and that we have inspected, that's been approved, and the amount that's been delivered. Now, you may see the significance in the difference on the amount of applications received, inspected, and approved. This is because majority of applications that come in that do not meet the requirements, they have been dropped off automatically. And because one of the reasons, like we try to emphasize while doing consultations for this initiative, is for our recipients to take ownership of the program. Only then it would be successful, and only then we would know that once the tank has been placed in each of these recipients' residents, they will maintain, sustain the tanks that has been given to them. Some of the challenges that we had gone through during the duration of this program, one was during the COVID-19 lockdown, the restrictions of movement. Some of our recipients were not able to receive their tanks because of this, because we could not go into their areas because they were on lockdown. And it was also difficult for our vendors to get in their raw materials into the country to make tanks. Another challenge that we went through was the change of context. Most of our recipients, upon application, they provide us with phone contacts that are, upon our delivery, they have changed their context, but they did not update us. So they lose out. But unless and until they come into our office to inquire, then we would receive their updated contact and then we'll deliver their tanks accordingly. Poor road conditions that restricts our delivery, particularly here in Fiji, we have rugged roads into our highlands, the interior areas of Viti Levu. This is namely in Namosi, Neitasiria, Serua areas, whereby road conditions is a great challenge for our vendors as well as for ourselves when we have to deliver the tanks. Delay in arrival of raw materials from our vendors' end. Once there's a delay of raw materials, it also delays our delivery, and our recipients are actually agitated on why the delays. But with communications, with capacity building, it it closes the gap with good communications on both ends.
We've just got a few minutes left, Alicia.
Okay, I think just have a few more things, but one of the things that we see that's very helpful throughout this initiative is the continuous correspondence with our community members, that is continuous awareness on the care and maintenance of their tanks, getting them to to participate from the very beginning up until we deliver their tanks. And I believe from our end, awareness and participation, continuous participation for our participants is key in ensuring that all our initiatives with regards to rainwater is successful. And ever since we've taken on this initiative, it has proven to be successful so far. And that is just a picture to see, to actually just show the forum of how we do our inspections on the requirements and the tanks that's been placed into the various communities across Fiji. So those are just the benefits of this program, and that improves water storage capacity, enables safe hygiene. It gives them the same access to clean water as to our customers living in the urban areas, and ensures them that it helps improve their sanitation conditions, and it also helps reduce the spread of waterborne diseases. That is just a snapshot of the rural WASH program here in Fiji. That's just one aspect, which is through the rainwater harvesting tank initiative. Vinaka. Thank you.
Vinaka, Lucy, sorry we had to cut you a little bit short at the end there. It's certainly fascinating to see what's happening in Fiji as well. I'll just check the chat. So there's a couple of questions there. One for you, Lucy. For the intermittent supply areas, do the recipients there store water from the pipe scheme or only rainwater, or is it a mix of both in those tanks?
For our intermittent supply area, we supply them with tanks, provided it's connected to their gutterings. But should they, if they have plumbers that connect it to their tanks, that is totally up to them. But we'd mostly advise them that they should connect it to rainwater just to safeguard it, not to mix the treated water with rainwater.
Great. Oh, another one for you, Lucy, that's popped up. Have you got any evidence there, or any evaluation being done about comparing houses that get the tank and those that don't, about health measures or welfare measures? Have you done any analysis
in terms
there?
of evaluation, we've just been doing a process evaluation, whereby when we do consultations, they provide us case on what they had faced prior to when they had the tank and when they did not have the tank. But for those areas where they did not have tanks, and then we've provided them with these tanks, they've seen the difference, whereby they can have access to water when others don't, especially during emergencies. Others may state that the tank helps in their sanitation aspect, whereby the rainwater is actually used to connect to their piping in their toilets instead of drinking water. And whatever water that they have in the taps from our piped side is actually for their drinking water, because they sort of like have adjusted to the times when they get water. So the rainwater is just standby to assist in their sanitation, or it's just a standby for emergencies.
Great. Just see, we're out of time. Unfortunately, we won't get to our panel discussion today. Those presentations have been fascinating. So we'll let them go a little bit longer. So I hope everyone's enjoyed that. And I'd really like to thank our presenters that we've had today. They really have been really interesting discussions, really interesting case studies. So what we might do, if there's any questions pop up in the chat, or if people have got any questions, we can give some answers to those in our meeting notes that go out. So I think we've just got a couple of minutes for the poll. Do we want to run that, Sinead?
Yeah, I'll just
There we go. Okay, great. So yeah, if you want to give us a bit of feedback on the webinar, that'd be great. This is such an interesting and important topic for us that are working at, in particular for people living in the Pacific, that we'll take your feedback. If people are really interested in this, we might be able to explore it in a future webinar as well and go into some aspects in a bit more detail. So it looks like some good feedback came through there, Sinead.
Yeah. I think that gives everyone enough time.
Great.
Play that. Can you still see that one there?
Before, yep.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So lastly, before everyone disappears today, so look, a special thanks to all of our presenters and the introductions that we've had today. So I've really learned a lot, so that's really been fascinating. So thanks to everyone for coming. And now maybe if everyone could turn their cameras on, we can get our family photo that we try and do at the end of each of these webinars. So if you can just turn your camera on for a sec.